Hello and welcome to Magna's online seminar, 10 Strategies for Enhancing Learning in Introductory Courses, co-sponsored by Magna Publications and The Teaching Professor. I'm Rob Kelly, editor of The Teaching Professor and today's moderator. I'm pleased you could join us. If you haven't already printed the handouts, select the file you wish to print from the file share box on the left of your screen and then click the Save to My Computer button to download, open, and print it. You may listen to this seminar through your computer, or you may choose to listen through your telephone. To listen through the telephone, dial the number and use the access code shown in the box at the bottom left of your screen. There will be opportunities to interact with our presenter today by using the chat. You can send in your questions and comments throughout the session, and there will be several polls as well, so be on the lookout for those when the time comes. You'll be asked to submit your responses. And now I'm pleased to introduce our presenter, Dr. Barbara Jacoby. Barbara Jacoby is Faculty Associate for Leadership and Community Service Learning at the Adele H. Stamp Student Union Center for Campus Life at the University of Maryland, College Park. In this role, she facilitates initiatives involving academic partnerships, service learning, and civic engagement. She is a fellow of the university's Academy for Excellence in Teaching and Learning and was a Center for Teaching Excellence Lilly Fellow during the 2007-2008 academic year. Welcome, Barb Jacoby.
Thank you so much, Rob, and welcome to all of you. Thanks for joining me for this seminar on improving learning in survey courses. As you well know, introductory survey courses offer an overview of a broad topic or field of knowledge. They form the backbone of undergraduate education at most colleges and universities and also serve as the foundation courses for their disciplines. An introductory survey may be the only college-level course that non-majors take in the field, as well as the course on which potential majors may base their decision of whether they will choose to major in that field or not. Despite their critical role in the higher education landscape, introductory surveys, which are terms that I'll use interchangeably, by the way, although they're not necessarily synonymous, are notorious for low rates of student achievement and also satisfaction. When survey classes are large, low attendance is often another problem. Many students, however, dread survey courses, believing that they are likely to be neither interesting nor relevant. Particularly in the STEM disciplines, non-majors fear, and I can relate to this one from personal experience, fear that we will not do well. And for these and other reasons, many faculty members dislike teaching survey courses. As a result, despite the fact that introductory surveys may be among the most difficult courses to teach effectively, they are often relegated to the newest or least experienced members of the department. So before we get to looking really closely at what we can do about all this, I'd like us to take a moment to do 3 quick poll questions so we can see who's out there and what your experience and thinking is about survey courses. So here is the first one. And this is just to find out a little bit about you. So if you're in a group, please go ahead and select the response that applies to the most of you in the group. And I can see some results coming in right here. Yeah, it looks like a good combination of people there who are teaching your first survey course or have done one once, and a goodly number of you who have taught many of them, as have I. So that's great. Thanks. You can get a little idea of the distribution there, of where you are related to this. Let me move on now. The second slide. I'm sorry. The second one. The response that best describes my or our feelings about survey courses. They're invigorating to teach. Well, bless your hearts. I am really happy to see that, but kind of a little bit surprising. Oh, there's some other responses. Yep, it's part of the job. Some of you are saying that, and I'd just rather put a stick in my eye, as some of my colleagues tell me when I start talking about them. Well, this is very exciting. So then I expect, since a large percentage of you enjoy teaching survey courses, that we'll be able to have a lively discussion along the way. So that would be great. I'd love to hear some of the good things that you are doing. So let's move on to the third. And the third poll, can we improve learning in survey courses? So ranging from, yeah, there's an awful lot we can do, to, I just think it is the way it is. Well, let's look. There's a lot of optimists among you and a few skeptics. Yep. Maybe 70 to 30% skeptics. Very cool. Thank you. So this will give us an idea of of kind of where the approach that we are coming from. But no matter how you answered these questions, I'm going to assume that you joined us today because you find teaching survey courses to be challenging. And I don't think there's any question that they are. So I'm curious to see if you would be willing to take a moment to type into the chat, what are some of the challenges that brought you here today? Both those of you who really like teaching survey courses and those of you who are a little bit lukewarm. So I'm going to keep an eye on the chat, but meanwhile, I'm going to go ahead and tell you that I, the eternal optimist, find it very challenging, very difficult to imagine a survey course that does not have the potential to be a more vibrant and meaningful learning experience for our students, and also more rewarding for us to teach. And so as I watch your chats coming in, I will mention some of those as we go. So yeah, you're concerned about keeping it challenging and comprehensive enough for majors but not overwhelming for non-majors. How do we keep the students engaged? What are some concrete plans for figuring out what readings we should include? How do we keep students interested, finding creative and constructive ways to keep them engaged, engaging students in large classes? Yes, engagement, critical issue, no question about that. So what I'm going to do, what my plan is today, is to offer 10 strategies for enhancing teaching and learning in introductory survey courses through 4 cases, and by using many concrete examples across disciplines. So again, please feel free, as Rob mentioned, to use the chat at any time to ask a question or to share an example or strategy of your own. And yes, I'm seeing a couple more questions come in. Addressing diverse learning styles, we're going to talk about that. Keeping student attendance, we're going to get right to that. And how do we come up with materials that meet all of their needs? Yeah, all great questions, and they all are things that we are going to talk about. So I'm going to let you in on a really, really quick overview of the cases and strategies I'm going to present so that you can be thinking, meanwhile, of situations that you faced and that you'd like us to look at, and also what strategies you have used to address the issues in the 4 cases. So here, the first one, and there you go, keeping attendance, the case of the disappearing students. And the strategies here are telling students early what it is that they should learn and providing frequent feedback, making learning useful and relevant, and asking students frequently for their feedback about their learning. Then case number 2, the case of blaming the students. This case is closely related to the first case, the case of the disappearing students, because, of course, we blame them for disappearing. And the strategies here are managing cognitive load, so helping students to learn by providing structures for learning, and helping students learn through metacognition. Case number 3, the case of the 1,000-yard stare. I'm sure you all have seen this, as I certainly have. And my strategies don't make it only about content, offer a variety of ways to learn, and then teaching students to ask questions instead of only answering them. And then case number 4, to conclude, the case of pedagogy overload syndrome, when too many strategies can become overwhelming. Don't feel you have to embrace every new one that comes along, and certainly to use technology, but not as a panacea. So if you have questions, go ahead, feel free to type them in. And meanwhile, I am going to move on to case number one, case of the disappearing students. Or sometimes I have called it the case of the online shopping spree, which, yes, I saw a student doing in one of my classes, to my dismay. So strategy number one for addressing the case of the disappearing students: tell students what they should learn and give them early and frequent feedback. I know this sounds really basic, but how can I not start by talking about learning outcomes and saying that clearly stated learning outcomes are absolutely essential? You know that learning outcomes are statements of what a student should know and be able to do as a result of taking the course. They need to be stated using action verbs and to describe learning goals behaviorally. For example, here's an example. If the outcome is for students to understand a concept, like how many of us have a learn coming out, understand, blah, 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 do you mean that the student should be able to recall facts related to the concept, to summarize information, to apply information or predict consequences, to analyze or compare phenomena, to generate models related to the concept, to evaluate and justify arguments? You see what I mean? If you don't clearly state what you want students to learn, they won't know, you won't be able to assess their learning, and you won't know if they've achieved your learning outcome. So we'll look at some really good concrete examples of learning outcomes very shortly. Two tools that I literally cannot do without in my own teaching and that I highly recommend to you in this regard are curriculum maps and rubrics. There are examples in your supplemental materials. So the process that I use and really believe in is called backward design. Some of you may be familiar with this. And what it is, so of course, once you've clearly stated your desired learning outcomes, what's different about backward design is that the next step is to determine exactly what evidence will allow you and the students to know to what extent they have achieved the outcomes. So it's outcomes evidence, and then once you've determined what evidence should consist of, curricular mapping helps you to tie each reading, lecture, activity, and assignment directly to one or more of the learning outcomes. The map then provides for us a visual confirmation that we have addressed each outcome and that no assignment or activity is just kind of hanging out there, not related to one of the outcomes. Because if it's not, the students will figure that out. So proponents of backward design, including yours truly, believe that starting with what evidence will demonstrate student achievement rather than with what content will be taught is more likely to result in student success. And then as far as feedback is concerned, I believe in giving students the rubrics you will use to assess their learning very early on. We all know the value of rubrics for assessment because they provide clear, objective criteria for grading. That's great. But they also articulate expectations, or in students' terms, what counts, and the levels of quality from excellent to poor that you'll be looking for. So the point is, rubrics can teach as well as evaluate. When they're given to students early and used for formative assessment, which can be graded or not, they can help students not only understand how they are doing, but also what are the specific criteria for improving their learning. In addition to demonstrating learning, rubrics enable students to make dependable judgments about the quality of their own work. And so grades also then, hopefully, will not come as a surprise. So students can and should use rubrics to guide their own progress towards meeting your learning outcomes. And there are many other techniques for providing early feedback to students. You know some of these. And if you have others, please let us know through the chat. So minute papers in which students write answers to exam-style questions that then can be followed by comparing their answers in groups and then moving to a whole class discussion. Clicker questions works great in large classes in which students answer individually and then re-answer after discussion with others seated nearby to see if they want to change their answers to the correct ones. Weekly online practice exams, which can be peer graded using rubrics provided. And most of our courseware systems, Canvas, Blackboard, permit peer grading, very effective. And also weekly class note summaries, which ask students to state the 3 most important concepts from each of the week's lectures and or readings, and then any questions they have about the material. This also works really well as a group process, by the way. So as a little glimpse into the future, know that there are already MOOCs out there that are using formative multiple choice tests that have a testing mechanism that explains the right answer when students miss an answer. And it lets them see the reasoning behind the correct choice when they're right. I love this. The instructor of a course that uses this kind of formative assessment for a MOOC on Greek mythology, one of my favorite topics, says, and this is a quote, even in multiple choice or yes and no situations, you can actually induce learners to read out of the text, not into the text. So he has also used this process in addition to immediate feedback for students to help him redesign the course as he teaches it again and again. So if you have questions or strategies to share at this point, please go ahead and type them into the chat. I'll keep my eye on it as I move on to strategy number 2 in the case of the disappearing students, which is to make learning useful and relevant. Now, I could do entire seminars on this one. It's really, you know what it's really about? It's really about teaching students why we fell in love with our disciplines to begin with. For example, a professor who teaches Introduction to Microeconomics, which is required in his case for all majors in the business school and also can be used to fulfill a Gen Ed requirement, says, again a quote, "My goal is to have students who come regularly and pay attention be exposed to an effective, be exposed in an effective way to the ways an economist thinks." He says that he doesn't emphasize the discipline's mathematical aspects because asking students to run through equations is misguided in that it distorts economics into something mechanistic. And that, and again a quote, "It's easy to run through mindless exercises, but what I want to instill is a little bit of the gestalt, the deeper worldview of how an economist views microeconomics." So in his opening lecture to his 300 students, he says that the heart of the discipline goes beyond quantification. It's the science of society. It's what makes the world hang together. And so a mathematician colleague told me that more and more introductory math texts are using real-world context for instruction. This is what I mean about relevance. However, she says very few of the examples in those texts are relevant to young people today. For example, talking about a jar of jelly beans can be a fun way to learn about probability, but studying probability in the context of how the recently implemented state lottery increases the economic divide between rich and poor people in the state will allow the students to cover the same mathematical content while simultaneously investigating an important social issue which affects them and their neighbors, that of economic inequality. So some of you in the STEM areas may be familiar with AAC&U's Project Kaleidoscope, or PCAL, and also SENSOR, which stands for Science Education for New Civic Engagements and Responsibilities. I participated in a PCAL conference call a couple of months ago, and the facilitator started out by stating the purpose of PCAL, which I think applies certainly to courses well outside of STEM, and that to sustain student interest in science and math by creating a learning environment that is personally meaningful to students and faculty and suggests practical applications related to the experience of students. So one of my favorite examples of this, which is one of the model courses featured on the SENSOR website, is a general education survey course in biology. And I'm going to run through this as an example. But I see a couple questions, and let me talk about that. So one of the questions is, what makes these strategies particularly unique for large classes? They are not necessarily, the surveys are not necessarily large, depending on what type of institution you're at. And PCAL is Project Kaleidoscope. It's the American Association of College and Universities Project Kaleidoscope, which is about enhancing education in introductory STEM courses. And then how do you keep the Gestalt approach from becoming vague? Let's take a look at this Sensor example and see if that answers your question. So most Sensor courses, as I'd mentioned, are curricular approaches to improving science learning through engaging students with complex issues. Most Sensor courses are in the general education curriculum and are not targeted specifically at science majors. The Sensor approach requires students to engage in serious scientific reasoning, inquiry, and observation, so they're not exempt from that by any means, and explicitly connect scientific knowledge to public decision-making, public policy development, and then in Sensor's terms, the work of citizenship. And that's what I mean by relevance. So here is an example. This is one of the Sensor 2011 course models, biology course, and it's called Stem Cells and Social Justice. So here's the course description. It's an interdisciplinary, non-majors course that provides a balanced view of the biological, ethical, legal, and social justice dimensions of stem cell research. Students read many both scientific and non-scientific articles, as well as The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. Many of you may know this wonderful bestseller about a woman who had cancer surgery as an indigent patient in the 1950s at Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore. The surgeon removed some of her stem cells during the surgery intentionally and did not tell her nor request her permission, nor did he tell her family. Her stem cell line, now known as HES, has now produced billions upon billions of cells that are vital to research around the world. And so that's tools to aid learning outcomes related to this course. Now, students will be able to differentiate the various methods of developing stem cell lines and their implications for research and therapy. 2, students will be able to categorize and summarize evidence-based arguments for and against the liberalization of the HESI line and ways in which policy has been shaped by these competing positions. So there's the current policy issues. Recognizing the dominant narrative in which scientific research is positioned as progress, and to question the benefits and dangers associated with stem cell research as compared to other approaches that are used to promote the public good, and then to recognize and correct basic errors in representations of the scientific, ethical, and social dimensions of stem cell research. So there's the idea of what I would consider to be really high-quality learning outcomes. Now, as far as the learning activities, the faculty member specifies clearly in the syllabus that she employs a student-centered learning approach that features role plays and case studies. And we'll look more deeply as strategies as we look at experiential learning inside the classroom under strategy number 5. I encourage you to check out the full information on this course and others on the Sensor website, and that's listed in your resources. So I want to move on now to strategy number 3, The third strategy then for solving the case of the disappearing students, if you will, is to ask your students frequently for their feedback about their learning. So a form of assessment that I really believe in and use frequently is what Tom D'Angelo and Pat Cross call CATS, classroom assessment techniques. Some of you may be well familiar with these. They're quick, simple, and very straightforward ways to find out what students have to say immediately about their learning. And they have plenty to say if we only ask. I often ask students to jot down on a piece of paper, and it can be anonymous or not, as you please, the answers to questions like these. At the beginning of class, I might ask, what's your biggest question, or what was not clear to you regarding the readings for today's class? And then I look them over often as the students do an introductory group conversation or other activity so that I'm prepared to clarify and answer their questions during class before moving on. At the end of a class, I might ask, what was your biggest takeaway from today's class, or what questions remain in your mind at the end of today's class? Then if their takeaways don't square with what I had hoped or expected they would learn, I can make corrections for the next class as well as in the syllabus for the next time I teach the class. And I can use their questions then to begin the next class. You also can use short online surveys, check-in conversations as class begins in a smaller size class, obviously, or clickers in a larger class to get their responses to these kinds of immediate questions. So before we move on to the second case, are there any questions or strategies you'd like to suggest for the case of the disappearing students? And I will watch the chat and go ahead and move on to case 2, the case of blaming the students. So the strategies I propose to deal with this case are strategy number 4, which is managing cognitive load by providing structures for learning, and strategy number 5, helping students learn through metacognition. So before we get into them, I want to stop for a really quick moment here and ask you a question about Change Magazine. I really, really rely on Change. I got a lot of my strategies for this particular seminar from Change. So could you please respond to the poll for yourself again for a consensus of your group? How many of you know it, regularly use it, never heard of it? Yeah, I suspected it might be the case that a good half of you have never heard of it. More than half, 60% more. It's a really fine publication. I find it. This is no way a commercial for Change. I am not. I believe it's outstanding and well written, but I am not affiliated with it in any way. But I highly recommend that you get a subscription for yourself. It's $70 a year for an individual subscription, and very well worth it, or one for your department, or that you ask your campus library to subscribe. Because a number of the strategies that I am sharing with you, I have learned about through Change or reinforced through my work with Change. Okay, so that's good. Let's move on to strategy 4 then, which is managing cognitive load by providing structures for learning. So I have one of the many Change articles that I have found useful over the years goes back to 1999. Yes, I keep them organized month by month in files that describes what it looks like when learning doesn't go well, or the epidemiology of mislearning, if you will. The author, the amazing Lee Shulman, who's former president of the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching, says that there are 3 ways in which students mislearn. And I just love this, and I hope you recognize them. They forget, they don't understand what they misunderstand, and they are unable to use what they have learned. So he calls the first amnesia. The article is listed in your, by the way, I have the question, what's the title of the article? It's listed in your handouts, and the author is Shulman, S-H-U-L-M-A-N. So he calls the first of these amnesia, which Lee says is the most frequent pathology of learning, and that students ordinarily and regularly forget what they have learned in their classes. And he says that if we take learning seriously, we must take responsibility for the ubiquity of amnesia. We need to re-examine much of what we teach and how we teach it. Then he calls the second pathology phantasia, which he defines as the confident grasp of an idea or explanation that is fundamentally at odds with the correct idea or explanation. And he admonishes us that a strategically held misconception by students can interfere substantially with our good teaching that comes later. And the third pathology of learning, according to Lee Shulman, is inertia. Inert ideas, he says, are those that simply lie there in our minds doing nothing. They are not forgotten through amnesia nor fundamentally wrong, as in the case of Fantasia. They are just simply not in a form that lends them to any useful purpose besides being remembered. And students hate that. We can understand that. So the problem, Lee believes, is that those who are trying to remedy these afflictions usually believe that the reason students forget, misunderstand, or go inert is that they haven't been taught enough, and that the remedy is to teach them more. And the reality is not that we're not teaching enough. The problem is that we're not helping students manage their cognitive load by providing useful structures for learning. So cognitive load theory would tell us, it operates under the central premise that learners are only capable of attending to a finite amount of information at a given time due to the limited capacity of our memory systems. Therefore, it's necessary to manage the flow of information with which learners have to grapple. So in order to handle large amounts of information or complex tasks, we must divide them into meaningful units based on our knowledge of the content and the task structure. The more knowledge students have about a task, a situation, or a content area, the more efficiently and adaptively they are able to map discrete pieces of information onto schemas and then to apply the information in new contexts and situations. So a given learning task may impose different levels of cognitive load for different students based on their levels of relevant prior knowledge. Novices need to expend a great deal more effort to accomplish a task than someone who has more knowledge or experience. As a result, they may be unable to move forward and therefore revert to using erroneous approaches or previously held misconceptions, or worse yet, check their email or do some online shopping during the class. So there's, of course, a variety of ways to address this, and one of them is to have students work in groups where students who have more experience and more knowledge serve as facilitators, mentors for those who have less. And then another is to use scaffolding, which refers to cognitive support of learning that's provided during instruction, just as a physical scaffold, of course, provides temporary support to a building that's under construction. So some practices, some very specific practices that incorporate this understanding of cognitive load and scaffolding, and these are just a few of the many, include be careful to sequence course objectives so as to present material in the order in which it is needed. It sounds so simple, but it doesn't necessarily happen. If some topics build on others in the course, you should teach and assess the learning of the prerequisite pieces before they are needed. This means that we should teach processes and procedures in the same sequence that students will perform them, so that work products from preceding steps can be used in subsequent steps in problem solving. If the concepts, knowledge, or skills to be taught do not have an inherent sequence, then it's generally best to order them from simplest to most complex. And then once we figured out what content needs to be taught and the appropriate progression of topics, then it's important to let students in on the secret. If we simply turn them loose on the material without clearly presenting what they should be getting from it, much of their cognitive resources will be allocated to figuring out what it is that's important rather than focusing on constructing the knowledge necessary to meet our clearly stated learning outcomes. We can also provide the structures that students need to solve a problem by carefully and intentionally structuring the information we provide to effectively frame and analyze the problem or to provide a worked example. So this both demonstrates problem framing and provides a concrete model of an appropriate problem-solving strategy. So specifically, one could walk through a complete example and then help students get started with their own problem solving by giving them a partially worked example and asking them to pick up where the completed part of the example lets off. Then as students become more and more proficient in the latter steps, they can be given problems with fewer steps completed for them and ramp up to full problems after they have developed the knowledge and skills to solve them on their own. Yeah, I see a question there. A vocal majority of my students complain when I put them in groups. Any suggestions? We are going to be getting to the dreaded group project, as my students sometimes call it, shortly. So keep the questions coming, and I will keep my eye on the chat. But meanwhile, let's move on to strategy number 5, and that is helping students learn through metacognition. You don't have to go very deep into the literature on the scholarship of teaching and learning to encounter terms like metacognition, learning how to learn, and intentional learning. Metacognition, sometimes referred to a bit too simplistically as thinking about our thinking, refers to higher order thinking about how we learn, as well as how effectively or well we are learning. It includes activities such as planning how to approach a given learning task, monitoring comprehension, and evaluating progress toward the completion of a task. Because metacognition plays a critical role in successful learning, it's important to help students acquire the habits of mind that will make them better learners, both in our classes and lifelong. I know, some of you are thinking that a survey class is not the place to teach students how to learn. On the other hand, well, maybe it is. So here's just a really nice, simple example of how a math instructor helps students address math anxiety, which I, again, can really relate to through metacognition. So at the end of class, the instructor asks the students to respond to these questions. Were you interested in the lesson? Why or why not? What did you do to manage your level of interest? There's the metacognitive part. And then the second and third questions, was anything confusing to you? If so, how did you deal with your confusion? And step 3, how can you use what you learned for other assignments in this class and other classes? And these questions can be answered in pairs, small groups, or individually. There could be a class discussion based on the questions, or in a smaller class, the written answers could be handed in to the instructor for use in preparing for future students. For future classes. So in the meantime, please go ahead and share your questions or examples about metacognition or learning how to learn. And I will move on to case number 3. But I see a couple chats coming in. How do students learn how to sort good information from bad? Absolutely critical. Thank you so much for mentioning that, because metacognition is a perfect way for students to learn how to do that. Metacognition, or critical reflection, is really about analyzing and reconsidering any supposed form of knowledge, to use John Dewey's terms, in light of the grounds that support it or don't support it. And yes, we should be teaching students how to become information literate and to sort information. There's just so much information out there. No question about that. And an example that's just come in, we pair our college reading course, which includes learning and study skills, with a survey course this year in environmental science, giving us interesting results so far. That's terrific. Yeah, absolutely. Great example. Paired course model works really, really well in providing structured learning, in connecting learning, as well as offering students the opportunity for metacognition. Thank you. So let's move on to the case number 3, one of my favorites, the case of the 1,000-yard stare, or AKA the case of the zombie students, as one of my colleagues is talking about. So you know the stares I'm talking about. So strategy number 6, don't make it only about content. And here we go with this information literacy. So thanks for giving me the prompt on that, not that I wasn't ready for you. So the strategies here are, it's not only about content, and then number 7, we're going to get to that in a moment, offer a variety of ways to learn, and 8, teach students to ask questions instead of only answering them. So let's start with strategy number 6, don't make it only about content. I know sometimes we have no choice. Let me go back to the slide. Yeah, let me just stay there for a moment. I know that sometimes we have no choice. There's content we must cover so that students will be prepared for subsequent courses. I know this from having taught introductory French for many years, and knowing that many of us teach survey courses that fulfill Gen Ed requirements, and that will be the only course students will take in the subject. So we have to cover information. However, the reality is, I and many others of us who study teaching and learning believe that information literacy related to our topic is more likely to be of use to students than memorizing zillions of facts. So information literacy then begins with knowing when you need information, being able to identify the information that you need to understand an issue or address a question, finding the information you need, and using it effectively. It's also about now knowing how to question and challenge the authority and value of information rather than accepting whatever prepackaged information is available. So no question about that. So strategy number 6 then is related very closely to strategy number 7, which is my very, very favorite, and that's to offer students a variety of ways to learn. Despite the fact that there are some doubting Thomases out there, I know you are, I believe that students come to us with a wide range of learning styles or preferences about how to learn. This addresses the earlier question that came up. And that these styles or preferences about learning are really independent of ability, content, and background knowledge. The learning style proponents further believe that learning could be improved by matching the mode of instruction to the preferred learning style of the students. Whether or not catering to students' preferred learning styles helps them learn more or better, there's no doubt in my mind that all students benefit from a variety of learning activities. There's no question in my mind about that. It is incumbent upon us to find ways to connect our learning activities to the styles of the broadest cross-section of our students, to the broadest cross-section of our students, and then to find supplemental or alternative means of connecting with those who do not fit that profile. Now let me state it loud and clear right here, that lectures are not necessarily evil. Now recent research, yes it does, it shows that more than 40% of students in a typical lecture class are concentrating on something other than what the faculty member is talking about. And the first alternative we generally think of to lectures is group projects, or as my students my students say, like I mentioned before, the dreaded group project. So some of you may know me through my work on service learning, and I've also done a lot of work on other forms of experiential learning, both outside and inside the classroom. So there are several pedagogical as well as practical reasons why experiential learning works very well inside the classroom to counter these issues and to definitely provide different types of learning experiences for students. So eliminates boredom pretty well. So if students are doing experiential learning inside the classroom, even a large class, and we'll see in a second, faculty members can immediately correct misconceptions or misapplication of data rather than waiting until the students make the errors in homework or on exams. In-class opportunities are also very well suited to those students who are just plain too busy through heavy course load, work, family, to be able to add out-of-class experiential activities to their schedule. Again, it works very well with students with a variety of learning styles, and students can develop the skills to work and learn collaboratively from one another as they likely will in the workplace. And experiential learning enables us to flip the classroom, which prevents students from passively receiving material in class. So instead, in a flipped classroom, They would acquire information outside of the class by reading, watching lectures recorded by the faculty member, or by world-class experts through TED Talks or many other options that are becoming more and more available. So when students are in class, they can solve problems with their peers and their professor, applying what they've learned in new contexts and to new problems. It works very well in large classes because students can work in groups or observe others engaged in things like simulations. And we'll look at examples of this to respond to your question of a concrete example of experiential learning in just a moment. And then we can observe students engaged in applying knowledge and concepts in practice for the purpose of direct assessment of learning. And then experiential learning inside the classroom is far easier to organize and control, if you will, than out-of-class activities like service learning. There are many examples of experiential learning inside the classroom that I could share with you, but I'll just give you one and refer you, if you're interested in more, to the online seminar I did with Magna on this topic last October. So the example I'll share with you is simulations, because it's so role play in particular, because it's so adaptable to so many different contexts, and including large classes. So in role play, students are given a specific situation, real or hypothetical, which contains two or more different perspectives or viewpoints. The faculty members can then provide a brief that contains the situation and the different perspectives, which could then be handed out to students who come together in a group to work through the situation in class. Each student will have a particular objective or objectives that may be in conflict with one or more of the others in the situation. Now, this is how it can work really well in large classes. The role play would take place in front of the whole class, and then the instructor would ask the other members of the class to form small groups to process and discuss the role play in response to questions posed by the instructor. One member of each of the discussion groups could then be asked to state their most significant observation or reflection. Role plays work really well in many disciplines. And so in an infinitely variable example, I'll give you a specific one, role play can be used in history courses to bring pivotal situations alive. Students can be asked to become experts, in quotes of course, on the perspective of historical figures well in advance of the role play, and then can remain in persona following the simulation to answer questions from other members of the class. And so there you go with a few of the points about role play. There's also the elevator speech, the basic 1-minute speech. So students can be given 10 or 15 minutes to prepare a 1-minute speech. Again, works really well in large classes, in group work. And it can be as simple as in an art history course, for example, that each student could take a particular artwork and describe in 1 minute a highlight of what one would need to know in order to appreciate that work of art. Depending on the size of the class, the audience would then critique the elevator speech based on a rubric provided by the faculty member on a variety of how well the student makes the key points, the effectiveness of the pitch, the confidence level of the speaker, etc. So before I leave the case of the blank stares, I want to just really briefly mention strategy number 8, one that I learned from a young colleague of mine, Matthew Boker, who told me about it when I visited his college to do a workshop on critical reflection. And his article, Boker, is cited in the resources for this seminar. And it's about teaching students to ask questions instead of only answering them. So he offers the example of students of American history who've been taught only answers, perhaps hundreds and thousands, or hundreds or even thousands of historical facts. And so students who learn this way, Boker says, would be likely to see history as little more than a set of facts. And he says, to quote him, a domain where things were what they were and are what they are, much like that expression we often hear, it is what it is. So students who learn only facts, according to Boker, have not had the opportunity to practice and gain confidence in their abilities of hypothesizing, inferring, and questioning. Gets back to the information literacy. Worse, learning without questions produces a kind of ideology in which everything's already settled, in which everything is what it is, and again, and nothing more. So in order to learn by asking questions, students need to learn lots and lots of facts, without a doubt, and then to question and speculate about what might not be just as it is or as it seems. Students must be taught to ask questions. It doesn't happen spontaneously. They need to understand why asking questions is an important way to learn, and then encouraged to ask them. And yes, students need lots of facts in order to be able to ask good questions. And they must have access to a great many answers in order to devise a single educated question. As faculty members, we need to understand that questions without answers can be very frustrating for students, as well as we need to acknowledge that we don't necessarily have all the answers, and that sometimes there's just going to be silence when students are ruminating on figuring out what is the most relevant, most important, most pressing question for them based on all the facts that they have hopefully acquired. So as I ask you to think about how you might use these strategies, particularly the questioning approach, I want to quickly cover the fourth case, the case of pedagogy overload syndrome, and this relates to us. So no kidding at all. One of my faculty colleagues told me recently at a workshop on flipping the classroom that we are awash in information about teaching and learning. And so this case of a pedagogy, the case of pedagogy overload syndrome, occurs where we just can't take in one more new way of teaching. So strategy number 9 is don't feel you have to embrace every new strategy that comes along. I've already mentioned that lectures can be viewed as bad ways of teaching. And it's true that bad lectures limit students' motivation and learning. However, good lectures can be very inspiring and can have a positive, dare I say even transformative, impact on student learning outcomes. So what's a good lecture? Well, I believe good lectures share a number of properties with other effective pedagogies that we've been talking about. We establish the relevance of the material for students by making explicit connections to their goals or interests, to activate prior knowledge by connecting new content with what they already know and understand, and with problems that they're grappling with. They present information in a clear and straightforward manner, and they limit the information presented to a small number of core ideas that are thoroughly but not redundantly explained. And then another approach that is much maligned, as I'd mentioned, by students, the group project, the dreaded group project. However, when we looked at experiential learning, the simulation example we looked at, there are many ways to devise engaging group activities. I regularly engage my students in group work, and when I do, I make it very clear to them that one of my course learning outcomes is that they will be able to demonstrate collaboration and group problem solving, which I tell them that employers remind us are a very highly desired workplace skill. So I give my students broad project parameters and time to work on their projects in class. Also, very early on, I give them a group collaboration rubric and tell them that they will each use it to assess one another and themselves, and that I will use it to assess them based on my direct observation of their work together in a class project related to social change. That's what my course is about. So this encourages them to participate fully in the project, alleviating one of the prime student complaints about group work, and that's that some students just don't pull their load, causing others to do much or risk a low group grade. So the rubric that I use for this is in your seminar resources. This brings us to strategy number 10, which I know you've been waiting for. Use technology, but know that it's not a panacea. So online learning, blended learning, MOOCs, digital learning environments, gaming, so many terms, so many ways to use technology for learning. Do you sometimes feel that you're falling behind the times if you don't embrace them? I know that sometimes I do. Do you bounce from one to another trying to find a magic bullet that will improve your students' learning? You're surely not alone if that's the case. So I'm no Luddite, and I use online pedagogies in my classes, including videos, threaded discussions, and peer review. But my point here is that what makes online learning engaging and effective are the features that underlie the technology rather than the technology itself. So, for example, when games and other digital learning environments are developed in accordance with principles of effective pedagogy, they can achieve positive results. But they do not necessarily yield results that are better than less sophisticated instructional delivery methods that use the same principles. So using an online space doesn't determine how well students will learn, but using an online space effectively surely can. So similarly, there are faculty members who use seminar rooms like lecture halls, and those who use lecture halls as seminar rooms by using discussions in really creative ways. So I want to segue to a final poll here to get a sense of how many of you are actually using online discussions in your classes and finding them effective. How many are using them with mixed results, with poor results, or, yeah, I'm just not doing that yet, or doing that at all? Yep, mixed results, 100% of you. Fascinating. And some of you have never used them, but all of you have used the mixed results. And, you know, I can tell you, what I can tell you from my own experience is that if class time for discussion is limited, online interaction can be very effective so that you can hear from every student, even those who may be shy or have limited English vocabulary, and so who need to look up words before they enter the classroom, the online discussion rather. In another example, the online environment can be a more effective way for students to learn by case study as well as discussion, because they can immediately do searches on terms they don't understand. They can pull up examples, and they can research different angles in preparing their responses. This work can be done individually or in groups, either online or in class, or a combination of online and in class. So in an example from a blended course, online discussion can be useful for students who like to take the time to thoughtfully formulate a response before speaking, as well as those, like I mentioned, who are shy or for whom English is not their first language. However, if the online discussion seems disconnected from what goes on in class, students may not value it. So it's helpful to use a question or comment that ended the class to start an online discussion, or to use a thread from the online discussion to start an in-class conversation. So you get the point. Just because a technology exists doesn't mean we have to use it. However, it is wonderful that we have so many new and emerging ways to expand our repertory of teaching strategies. I'd love to hear your additional questions and thoughts about how you have used technology to enhance your students' learning, and also your final questions as I come to the conclusion of my 10 strategies for enhancing teaching and learning in survey courses. So I am delighted to see that you asked lots of questions in the chat. If there are questions that I did not have a chance to answer, as I'd mentioned, I will do so in writing afterwards, and Magna will distribute those. So in conclusion, I, like you, want to assure you that I incorporate lectures into my teaching. However, I also like to use strategies that require students to take initiative, make decisions, and assume responsibility for their own learning. I really enjoy guiding my students through the processes of posing questions, investigating, experimenting, being curious, struggling to solve challenging problems, being creative, and especially constructing meaning for themselves. When it all works, we engage students intellectually, socially, and emotionally, and as a result, they feel that their learning is authentic. One of my UMD colleagues, my University of Maryland colleagues, the former director of our Center for Teaching Excellence, has this tagline at the end of all his emails, and I will share it with you here. And there you go. It is teaching is leading students into a situation in which they can only escape by thinking. One of the great joys of teaching, and certainly of teaching introductory survey courses, is that we have the opportunity to create those situations, to guide students through them, and to watch them learn. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Barb Jacoby, and thank you all for joining us today. There may be a couple of questions that we didn't get to, and as Barb said, that she will respond to those, and we will send those responses out to you. Look for an email from us with a link to an email evaluation form. Please fill it out and tell us what you think of today's program and what programs you'd like to see in the future. Complete information about our upcoming seminars is available at www.magnapubs.com. Thanks again for joining us, and have a great day.